Welcome to the second part of Spooktober Fright Horror Fest Fall Fear Autumn month. Today with something I don't cover all that often. Commodore 64 games. Now this may be mostly because around here the Commodore 64 was not what you would call a popular machine. These ZX Spectrum clones were at that time the only ones we had access to, unless you had connections in low places or high places. They were kind of the same places for a while. So for the most part, until emulators came along, there wasn't really a way for most of us to play Commodore 64 games at all. And one of those games is the subject of today's show. That is called Project Firestart, and it was developed by a company called Dynamics in the year 1989. Yes, the very same Dynamics that in the very same year also created MechWarrior, though for much more powerful systems. And the same Dynamics that would create Red Baron and Tribes and, well, a lot of games. We should honestly talk about Dynamics more often because they have made a whole lot of games. And Project Firestart was one of them. This was technically a bit before the whole cinematic style of video game, if you will, although thankfully no, since Jordan Mechner's Karateka was already out. It had been out for many years, and he was working on Prince of Persia. Thankfully Prince of Persia was done, but Broderbund was digging around with him, so they didn't release it at that time. I say this because there are a few similarities between Prince of Persia and Karateka, if you will, and Project Firestart in the way that the interface is laid out, with little arrows for your health, for your ammunition, and of course with the fact that it's, well, kind of a cinematic style of game, back when cinematic used to mean something good. You for the most part treated to just you and the environment. It even has cutscenes in it. Cutscenes that I had no idea the Commodore 64 could actually handle. To be fair, they are very simplistic cutscenes, they're not all that complicated. They barely have a couple of frames of animation, but in them you can see very primitive elegance in their movement and the style they wanted to create. And they're done, well, yeah, they do have dialogue, but it's not spoken because you couldn't really fit that on a Commodore 64. You just had text. The presentation of the game in general is quite impressive. Now the footage you're seeing on the background is maybe a bit more colorful than it would be on a normal Commodore 64. I haven't really had much experience with tweaking settings for that Commodore 64 emulator thing. I honestly haven't figured out how to get it to not pretend like it's reading off an actual Commodore 64 floppy, so it would load faster between levels without having it run at 500 times the normal speed and become unplayable. But even so, Project Firestart is what you could call kind of the blueprint for the survival horror. It did this before Resident Evil. It did this even before Alone in the Dark. And it did so in a way that may a bit remind you a tiny amount of games like Dead Space. Especially near the end, where there's that unkillable monster that's chasing you around and you can't kill it, you can shoot it, which was one of the highlights of Dead Space 2, an otherwise quite boring game. Dead Space 2, I mean, not Project Firestart. Project Firestart is a game that is, well, you can tell it was made when it was made for the platform it was made on, because it doesn't have what you would call the trappings of a more user-friendly experience, like a map. It sort of puts it up to you to create your own map, to figure out what corridor leads to where each and every room is on this space station. Kind of like what a lot of games used to do back in the day. And I don't fault it for doing that. I mean, they couldn't fit another map in the space they had. And the environments are distinct enough so that getting confused doesn't really become that much of an issue after a while, after you learn what's where. I'm honestly a bit surprised at how technologically competent it is. But then again, I don't have that much of experience when it comes to Commodore 64 games. Compared to a Spectrum game, my god, it's night and day. So what's the idea of the game? Well, you are John Hawking, and you are sent on a research ship that is orbiting Titan. And there you must fight Shodan. Well, actually, no. There is a bit of System Shock in it, and by that I mean there's a bit of Project Firestart in System Shock. You can kind of see the parallels with what they're trying to do, because at its basis, it's a story about how somebody tried to make some biological experiment that went awry, and that experiment killed everything on board, and now you have to get the research papers, the documents, all the files, figure out what happened, and you have to blow up the ship. And along the way, you may save 1 or 2 people. And you do this in a fashion that is not linear. This is not a by the numbers side-scrolling shooter. This is very much a blueprint for what you would see later years in Alone in the Dark and System Shock, and of course in Resident Evil and games like that. It's a more open type of environment. You are free to go wherever you want to and try to figure out how to fix this problem. Also, the game is a bit in real time because, well, things will happen in real time. You will see cinematics that show you a meanwhile and pop up a scene of something happening somewhere else. And depending on how long you take, those scenes may happen sooner or later, and some scenes may, well, end up differently than they normally would if you take too long, if you're not careful. Now, of course, you can absolutely die at any point. You can even leave the ship that you're on the moment you get onto it and get a game over, and your superiors from the United System States will be very, very disappointed with you because you're a coward. You fled. You did not complete your mission, soldier. I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that this is the formula of the survival horror distilled in its essence. You start with a gun that has limited ammunition. It takes 4 hits to kill a monster. You have a finite amount of health that will drain quite quickly, especially because you can't see the monsters attacking you. It's one of the limitations of the platform. They don't really move. When they attack, they just move towards you, and it's up to you to find places where you can heal yourself, to find more guns, to find better guns, to not think, oh look, there's a bunch of TNT. I wonder if I can press the interact button, which is also the shoot button, because there is no other buttons on the Commodore 64 joystick, to grab that piece of TNT that's just there in that giant pile of TNT and use it against the monsters instead of shooting at it and blowing myself up. Spoiler alert. Probably seen it in the background if I remember to edit it in. You will blow up if you do that. Again, it's a limitation of the platform. You can only interact with things that the game tells you can interact with the little text underneath. For example, you can open and close doors, which is an important thing to do because the monsters, I'm not sure if they can actually open doors. So if you close them, you will not be ambushed by them. The game succeeds at being a horror game, at being a title where you are nervous about your environment because you're never sure where they're gonna come from next. Are they behind you? Are they in front of you? Especially because the game doesn't really do sound all that great. My version especially seems to not have had maybe the best sound performance. I think in some versions you can actually hear footsteps, though I'm not entirely sure you can. It seemed like you could. Not in this one though. You do hear certain sound effects when the monsters show, well, that's the music, and some audio cues when certain events happen. Much like, well, a lot of games in this genre, it is very much about you trying to explore this environment without being killed and trying to find ways that this environment can help you overcome an enemy that you are not really equipped to fight. It even has the one of these staples of this kind of setting with there being journals on computers that you can find, but they're on computers. Nobody threw away an audio cassette in the rubbish bin with their deepest, darkest thoughts. To be honest, it got even sillier when Bioshock Infinite did it, because there were record players who throws away a record. It makes more sense in this game. Actually, it made sense in System Shock as well, because there were mostly emails that you would read. Here you'll find logs, you'll find out what happened, you'll find some hidden clues about how to deal with your enemies, about a secret buried beneath, about why are there monsters? I think I already told you there were genetic experiments, but why were they created? By whom? And will this play a role in the endings? Because there are multiple endings. That's a thing that the game has. I already told you one. You can leave immediately and get a game over. You basically finish the game, but not in the best optimal way. And that's That's actually a staple of survival horror in general. I mean, good survival horror. You will get multiple endings depending on how well you did, how far you went, how much of an effort you put into it. Sort of like you could with Clock Tower. But we'll talk more about that in a different episode. Now sure, it may not be the easiest game to play nowadays. Actually, no, it is still easy to play. You just have 5 buttons. You have directions and shoot. There's nothing else to it. It may take you a while to get adjusted to the environment, planning it out, drawing yourself a map, keeping note of where you can find weapons, where you can find some health, where the important buildings are that you have to revisit to send you reports and stuff, where there's high chances of you finding enemies. But that's part of the fun of the games that used to be back in the old days. They took some tiny bit of effort on your part, some planning on your part, on your end. They made you work a bit. And if I still had the time to play games like this properly, I'll probably still do that. But gone are the days when I would take the time to measure the sun at noon in each port and Sid Meier's Pirates and draw myself an accurate map of the in-game world so I could just use that for navigation, and then complain the one never ever went in the opposite direction, so that some ports were completely unreachable in combat. But that's a whole other matter. Technically, you can actually find the game for free on the Internet Archive. A major upload of a lot of Commodore 64 games went up a couple of days ago. Though that version of Project Firestart that I found there is just the first disc, and it didn't work. But I don't think Dynamics will care if you download the YARHARHAR version of the game and emulate it. Electronic Arts may throw a stink since they publish it, but they've done nothing with it. Technically, they made Dead Space, which is kind of the same thing. And apparently there's actually a remake of it made in 2009 that is in 3D, in first person even. I haven't played it. I don't know how good it is, but, well, it looks a bit like System Shock, which kind of does make sense, since if you were to put Project Firestart in first person, it would indeed resemble System Shock. Though I wouldn't say this looks all that great. It could really use like a proper actual remake with all the bells and whistles. Just leave it like it was. A side-scrolling, deeply terrifying exploration survival horror game where you can walk into a freezer and die. Next week, we move on to a different time and place and space, and we will be alone in the dark. So bring a flashlight. Goodbye.